The year is 1944. The place is the muddy, shell-shocked fields of France just weeks after D-Day. The situation is terrifying. The Allied forces are pushing deep into Nazi-occupied territory, but they are outnumbered in many places. The German army is waiting with heavy Tiger tanks and thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. To win, the Allies needed a miracle. But instead of sending in more tanks, they sent in artists. Imagine you are a German scout looking through your binoculars. You see a massive field filled with American Sherman tanks. You hear the rumble of engines. You hear soldiers shouting orders. You see the dust rising. You count 30,000 men ready to crush you. You call your generals and tell them to move your entire army to stop this massive force. But there was a secret. If you had walked up to one of those tanks and poked it with your finger, it wouldn't have gone clink. It would have gone hiss. This was the Ghost Army. A group of 1100s men who used nothing but air, speakers, and paint to trick the most dangerous army in the world. They didn't win by killing. They won by lying. This is the story of how a few artists made an entire army vanish into thin air. The recruiters, art schools over boot camp. For this mission, the U.S. Army did something completely unexpected. Instead of searching for the best snipers or toughest soldiers, they went to art schools. Recruiters visited places in New York and Philadelphia, looking for painters, illustrators, architects, designers, and even actors. These were people trained to see the world differently, not through weapons, but through creativity. Among those chosen were men who would later become famous. One was Bill Blass, who went on to be a legendary fashion designer. Another was Ellsworth Kelly, who later became one of the most important modern painters in the world. At the time, however, they were young artists being pulled into a secret military effort. Their job had nothing to do with shooting or fighting. They were recruited because of their imagination and visual skills. The army needed people who could design illusions, hide equipment, and trick the enemy's eyes. These artists were asked to think creatively under pressure and solve problems in ways soldiers normally wouldn't. When they were recruited, they were given a simple but powerful message. Your mission is to use your imagination to save lives. Instead of pulling triggers, they would use paint, fabric, light, and deception. It was a different kind of warfare, one where creativity became a weapon and art helped shape the outcome of battle. The inflatable arsenal, the rubber tanks. One of the most famous tools used by the Ghost Army was the inflatable tank. These tanks were made of rubber and filled with air, but from a distance or from the sky, they looked just like real heavy steel tanks. Enemy pilots flying overhead could easily mistake them for powerful armored units preparing for battle. The idea was simple but clever. If the enemy believed a large number of tanks were gathered in one place, they would move their forces to defend against an attack that was never going to happen. This helped protect real soldiers fighting somewhere else. However, the inflatable tanks came with a strange problem. Because they were filled with air, they were extremely light. In real life, a tank weighs around 30 tons. But these fake ones could sometimes be picked up and carried by just 4 soldiers. If an enemy spy saw that happen, the entire secret would be ruined instantly. Because of this, the soldiers had to act as much as they had to build. They pretended the tanks were heavy, moved slowly, and followed strict routines. Every action had to look real. In this kind of warfare, even walking the wrong way could give everything away. The success of the inflatable tanks depended not just on how they looked, but on how well the soldiers played their roles. Sonic deception. The sound trucks. A silent army wouldn't fool anyone. To make their illusion believable, the Ghost Army used sound as a weapon. They mounted huge speakers onto trucks, powerful enough to be heard up to 15 miles away. These were not random noises. They were carefully recorded sounds of real military activity. The speakers played the rumble of tank engines, the clanking of metal, soldiers shouting commands, men digging trenches, and even the noise of bridges being built. To German forces listening from a distance, it sounded like a massive army moving into position. But in reality, there were only a few dozen soldiers operating the equipment. The deception was extremely detailed. The Ghost Army had different sound recordings for different situations. Weather mattered. On clear nights, the sounds were sharp and loud. On foggy nights, they played creaking, slow, uneasy noises designed to make German troops nervous and unsure of what was coming. Every sound was chosen to match what a real army would be doing at that exact moment. It was like creating a movie soundtrack for a battle that didn't exist. The enemy couldn't see the army clearly, but they could hear it, and that was enough. By controlling what the Germans heard, the Ghost Army made them believe a huge force was nearby, proving that in war, sound can be just as powerful as sight. Radio fakery, the mock chatter. During World War II, German intelligence spent hours every day listening to Allied radio traffic. They believed radio signals could reveal where troops were moving and what they planned to do next. The Ghost Army turned this habit into a powerful weakness. They used highly trained radio operators who could copy real military radio styles perfectly. These operators created fake radio networks, pretending to be entire units talking to each other. Each operator played a role, using the correct accents, slang, and radio habits so the conversations sounded completely real. Most of the messages were boring on purpose. Soldiers talked about needing more food, being tired, or complaining about the weather. This made the chatter feel natural. But hidden inside these normal conversations were small mistakes. A soldier might casually mention a town name or hint at where the unit was moving next. German listeners took these messages seriously. They wrote everything down, studied the patterns, and used the information to move their troops. The problem was simple: the information was fake. While German forces rushed to defend the wrong areas, the real Allied armies moved elsewhere. Without firing a shot, the Ghost Army used radio waves to confuse the enemy. By faking conversations instead of battles, they proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is a convincing lie. The atmosphere squads. This was the most human and subtle part of the Ghost Army's deception. Instead of using equipment, these soldiers used behavior. Small groups were sent into nearby French towns, wearing the shoulder patches of well-known U.S. Army units. Anyone watching would assume those famous divisions were nearby. The soldiers acted casually and on purpose. They went into cafes and bars, talked loudly, and let secrets slip into conversation, always assuming German spies were listening. They might mention troop movements, upcoming attacks, or where their unit was supposedly heading next. Everything sounded natural, like careless talk after a long day. Outside the towns, the deception continued. Trucks were driven in circles over and over again, kicking up dust and noise to make it seem like thousands of soldiers were passing through. Camps were dressed up to look lived in. Soldiers even hung fake laundry on clotheslines, creating the illusion that a large unit had settled there for days. None of this was accidental. Every detail was planned to create the right atmosphere. To the enemy, it looked and felt like a real army was present. In reality, it was only a handful of soldiers acting their parts perfectly. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes convincing people what to believe is just as important as firepower on the battlefield. Operation Viersen, the big test. In March 1945, the Allies needed to cross the Rhine River into Germany. This was a massive, dangerous mission. The Ghost Army was told to draw the Germans away from the real crossing point. They set up 200 inflatable tanks and played the sound of a huge army moving. The Germans were so convinced that they opened fire on the Ghosts with everything they had. While the Germans were busy shooting at rubber balloons, the real US Army crossed the river miles away with almost no resistance. The danger of being a ghost. You might think playing with balloons sounds safe, but it was incredibly dangerous. The Ghost Army had to be close to the front lines, sometimes just a few hundred yards from the Germans. They had no heavy armor. If the Germans realized the tanks were fake, they would have charged in and wiped out the 1,100 artists in minutes. They were bait, and they knew it. They had to be perfect actors, because one mistake meant death. Close calls and near disasters. There is a famous story about two Frenchmen who rode their bicycles past a Ghost Army camp. They saw 4 American soldiers pick up a tank and turn it around by hand. The soldiers realized they had been seen. They had to chase the men down and swear them to secrecy. If those 2 men had talked to the wrong person, the entire Allied strategy in France could have collapsed. The 50-year secret. When the war ended in 1945, the men of the Ghost Army were given a final order, one they could never disobey. They were told to go home and never speak a word of what they had done. Not to their wives, not to their children, not even to history itself. Their missions were buried under layers of classification. Official records were stamped top secret. Photographs were locked away. Reports were sealed. To the outside world, these men returned as nothing more than ordinary soldiers, carrying a truth they were forbidden to share. For nearly 50 years, their story remained invisible. Generations passed without knowing that entire battles had been shaped by deception rather than gunfire. The artists, designers, and sound engineers who had fooled the enemy simply faded back into civilian life, their greatest victories erased from memory. It wasn't until 1996, when the files were finally declassified, that the truth emerged. Only then did the world realize that some of the most successful soldiers of World War II never fired a shot, yet helped change the course of the war by mastering illusion, misdirection, and the psychology of fear. Saving lives with art. Historians now estimate that the Ghost Army's elaborate deceptions saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives, not by fighting harder, but by fighting smarter. Their inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and carefully staged performances convinced German commanders to move troops, artillery, and firepower toward places where no real attack would ever come. While the enemy watched shadows and illusions, the real Allied forces advanced elsewhere with minimal resistance. Entire divisions crossed rivers, secured territory, and broke through defenses without triggering the massive, bloody battles that defined so much of World War II. These 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers proved something revolutionary. War could be shaped by perception as much as firepower. A painted canvas, a rehearsed movement, or a fabricated radio signal could alter the course of thousands of lives. They didn't overpower the enemy, they outthought them. And in doing so, they showed that sometimes a paintbrush truly is more powerful. The story of the Ghost Army is a beautiful reminder that even in the middle of the darkest war, creativity and imagination can be life-saving tools. These men used their talents to create a theater of war that saved thousands of families from losing their fathers and sons. But it leaves us with a haunting question for our own time. In 1944, it took 1,100 artists and thousands of balloons to fool an army. Today, with deepfakes, AI, and digital trickery, how do we know what is real? If the Ghost Army could make 30,000 soldiers vanish using only rubber and speakers, what is being hidden from us today with much better technology? The ghosts of 1944 are gone, but their lesson remains. What you see is not always what is there. If you were a general, would you trust an army made of air? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to discover more secret units and untold stories from World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button. History is full of ghosts. Let's find them together.